Also, the king cannot castle if he's going to end up on a square where he's in check. Like if I wanted to go to this side now, 1 and 2, notice that my king will be in check by that rook. So that's not allowed. You cannot put yourself into check. So now you know the rules for the king to be able to castle. And there's one more that is pretty obvious, but I would like to highlight it. And for that, let me first remove this rook. That rule is that you cannot have any pieces in between the king and the rook. It has to be clear for them to be able to castle. So let's say I have a bishop over here. I could castle to this side, but not to this side. So it would require for me to just move the bishop out first. Maybe they move the king, and now I could go ahead and castle. Okay, so that's it. That's what castling means. Now let me bring all of the pieces on the board for you to see it with all of the pieces. And by the way, I'm going to talk so much about castling because this is something that you're supposed to do at the beginning of the game every time. You develop your knights and bishops, and soon after you're going to put your king in safety to move him away from the center. But let me give you this example with all of the pieces on the board. So with the pawns, immediately I'm going to try to develop this knight and this bishop to be able to castle. If I wanted to castle to the other side, I'm going to have to move 3 pieces instead because the queen is also in the way of the king and this rook. So I move my knight, then the bishop, and now look, I'm ready to castle. And by doing this, my king is walking away from the center, and it's going to be on the side of the board protected by 3 pawns, the knight, the pawn, and this rook can now come over and start putting pressure to attack this king who's still in the center. Now, if I go a few more moves, maybe I can show you the black pieces castling in this case. So I'm on purpose trying to castle the king to this side. So now they could just go 1 and 2. And notice how the computer does the rest for me. I just need to put the king 1 and 2 here. And the rook came over and castled. That's it. Again, the idea is to have your king in a safer place and also help the rook come from the corner all the way to the center. So one more time, if it's confusing, just like promotion, don't worry, we're going to talk so much about these roles in future lessons. Okay, so then let's move on to the last rule that we have for today, and that one is en passant. En passant also has to do with pawns. This one, to be honest, you don't get it so much in your games, and for now I just want you to be aware of it. So here we go. Let's say I move this pawn up 2 steps, the black pieces move this knight, then I move my pawn. Well, the book definition says that if you have one of your pawns on the 5th rank and one of your opponent's pawn moves 2 steps and land next to you, you can actually capture the pawn. Now, let me rewind that. So if this pawn moved 1 step, can we capture it? Yes, we could just go 1 step diagonally. That's how the pawn captures normally. Good. But if this pawn moves 2 steps, then we can now move to the side and capture, but thanks to en passant, we can capture diagonally anyways. And technically this happens because this pawn, even though he moved 2 steps, since he's at the very beginning, he technically went through this square before he could get here. So you're allowed to do it. It works for this pawn in this case, but also for this pawn. He's going to move 2 steps and land right next to your pawn. So let me go back. And 1 and 2. Now I could do en passant. Now the only thing to remember here is that you have to do en passant if you want to do it. You don't have to do it. But if you wanted to do it, you have to do it right away on the spot. Let's say I want to do check first. I'm going to bring my bishop here, check, then they block the check, and now I try to do en passant. I'm not allowed to do it. It has to be on the spot. So that's it. So that's the book definition, but the way I break it down for many of my students is almost the same, but just a little bit different. Don't worry too much about the 5th rank. Just know that if any of your opponent's pawns moves 2 steps and lands next to you, those are the 2 conditions. He had to move 2 steps and he has to land next to one of your pawns. Well, you could do en passant. That's a rule. So now let me just to finish with en passant, let me do it from black's perspective. So let me start with the white pieces. White pieces always go first, then they move this pawn. Let's say I go here, they move again. And now if I move this pawn or this pawn 2 steps, they could do en passant. Like look, I go 1 and 2, I went 2 steps and I landed next to the pawn. So he could do en passant. It's very important that you realize this pawn is not on the 5th rank. It's number 4, but from black's perspective, that would be 1st, 2nd, 3rd, 4th, 5th rank. So it tends to be a little bit confusing, but if you just remember that if one of your opponent's pawns moves 2 steps and lands next to you, then you could do en passant. That should be way easier. You don't have to worry so much about what rank he's on and things like that. So again, guys, I know you don't have to tell me this rule is a little bit more confusing, but don't worry. I just wanted you to be aware of them. Now, castling and promotion, I really need you to understand them before we move on. So if you still feel a little bit confusing about castling, there's something that you could do. Just set up the board and remove all of the pieces except for the king and the rook. So I'm gonna do this. I'm gonna take them all off the board, leave the king and the rooks on the original squares, and practice castling. So I'm gonna take them all out. So here we go. Okay, so there's the original square. If I want to castle to this side, the king moves 1, 2, and then the rook goes over it. That's it. Let me put it back. I go to the other side, 1 and 2, and the rook goes over it. And that's it. If you do this a few times, trust me, you're gonna get the hang of it.